An outdoor sign mounted on a building is considered a separate structure and requires its own disconnecting means. The disconnecting means for a sign must be service rated, which means it must be capable of carrying the full load current and interrupting the circuit in case of a fault. Here are some possible solutions. Firstly, install a fuse or circuit breaker disconnect rated for the combined load of the three circuits, 60 amps, at the base of the sign or in a nearby enclosure. Secondly, install 3 service rated disconnects, one for each circuit, at the base of the sign or in individual enclosures. And thirdly, move the toggle switches from the sign to the building and ensure they are located within 6 feet of the sign. This would allow the switches to be considered as disconnecting means for the sign since they are now part of the building. However, the switches must still be service rated. Now let's elaborate on each of these points, providing more detail on the requirements and implications. When dealing with electrical installations, especially those involving outdoor signage, adherence to the National Electrical Code, or NEC, and local electrical codes is crucial. These codes are designed to ensure safety and prevent electrical hazards. The inspector's concern revolves around the fact that the sign is considered a separate structure from the building. According to electrical codes, any separate structure needs to have its own disconnecting means. This is to allow for safe isolation of the electrical supply to the structure for maintenance, repairs, or in case of an emergency. The critical point is that the disconnecting means must be service rated. What does it mean for a disconnect to be service rated? A service rated disconnect is designed to handle the full available fault current at the service entrance. This means it can safely interrupt the circuit under both normal load conditions and fault conditions, such as a short circuit. Standard toggle switches are generally not designed for this purpose. They may not have the necessary interrupting capacity and could fail catastrophically under a fault. Let's consider each of the solutions. Firstly, installing a fused or circuit breaker disconnect rated for the combined load. The sign is fed with 3 120-volt circuits, each protected by a 20 amps breaker. This does not necessarily mean that the sign's total load is 60 amps. It means that the wiring is capable of handling up to 60 amps combined. To determine the appropriate size for the disconnect, you need to calculate the actual load of the sign. This involves summing the current draw of all the lighting elements and any other electrical components within the sign. Once you have determined the actual load, you can select a disconnect switch or circuit breaker with a rating that exceeds this load. For example, if the sign's actual load is 30 amps, a 40 amps or 60 amps disconnect would be suitable. It is generally good practice to select a disconnect with a slightly higher rating than the actual load to provide a safety margin. The disconnect can be either a fused disconnect or a circuit breaker disconnect. A fused disconnect uses fuses to provide overcurrent protection, while a circuit breaker disconnect uses a circuit breaker. Both types are acceptable as long as they are service rated and have the appropriate interrupting capacity. The disconnect should be installed at the base of the sign or in a nearby enclosure. This location should be readily accessible for maintenance and emergency shutoff. The enclosure should be weatherproof to protect the disconnect from the elements. Secondly, let's consider installing 3 service-rated disconnects, one for each circuit. This approach involves installing a separate disconnect for each of the 3 120-volt circuits feeding the sign. Each disconnect would need to be service-rated and sized appropriately for the load on its respective circuit. This approach can be more expensive than using a single disconnect, but it provides additional flexibility and isolation. For example, if one circuit needs to be energized for maintenance, the other 2 circuits can remain energized. Each disconnect should be installed in its own enclosure, and the enclosures should be weatherproof. The disconnect should be located at the base of the sign or in a nearby accessible location. Thirdly, consider relocating the toggle switches to the building. If the toggle switches are moved from the sign to the building and are located within 6 feet of the sign, they can be considered as the disconnecting means for the sign, provided they are service rated. The 6 feet distance is important because the disconnecting means must be readily accessible from the sign. This requirement is intended to allow someone working on the sign to quickly de-energize a circuit in case of an emergency. However, it is important to note that the switches must still be service rated. Simply moving the existing toggle switches to the building will not solve the problem if they are not service rated. You would need to replace them with service rated switches. Additionally, the switches must be readily accessible and clearly labeled to indicate their function. Some additional considerations involve grounding. The sign must be properly grounded in accordance with the NEC and local codes. This is to provide a path for fault current to flow back to the source, which helps to trip the overcurrent protection device and prevent electrical shock hazards. The grounding conductor should be sized appropriately for the circuit and connected to a grounding electrode system. Also consider bonding. All metallic parts of the sign, including the enclosure and any metal conduit, should be bonded together to create an electrically continuous path. This helps to minimize the risk of electrical shock and prevent the buildup of static electricity. And finally, labeling is important. The disconnecting means should be clearly labeled to indicate that it controls the sign. This helps to prevent accidental disconnection of the wrong circuit. The label should be durable and weather resistant. In summary, the inspector's concern is valid. The sign is considered a separate structure and requires a service-rated disconnecting means. The existing toggle switches are likely not adequate because they are not service-rated. The best solution is to install a fused or circuit breaker disconnect rated for the combined load of the sign at the base of the sign or in a nearby enclosure. Alternatively, you could install 3 service-rated disconnects, 1 for each circuit, or relocate the switches to the building and replace them with service-rated switches. It is important to consult with a qualified electrician to determine the best solution based on local codes and the specific circumstances of the installation. They can perform the necessary load calculations, select the appropriate disconnect, and ensure that the installation is safe and compliant with all applicable codes. Remember that electrical work can be dangerous, and it is always best to leave it to the professionals. They have the knowledge, skills, and experience to do the job safely and correctly. Failure to comply with electrical codes can result in fines, penalties, and potentially dangerous situations. Ensuring safety should always be the top priority. Also, it is important to note that local amendments to the NEC may exist. Always check with the local authority having jurisdiction or OJ to verify the specific requirements in your area. They may have additional rules or regulations that you need to follow. For example, some jurisdictions may require a specific type of disconnect or may have additional grounding requirement. Be aware of these local amendments and make sure that your installation complies with all applicable codes. The NEC is a comprehensive document, but it is not a substitute for professional judgment. A qualified electrician can assess the specific situation and make recommendations based on their expertise and experience. They can also help you to navigate the complexities of the electrical code and ensure that your installation is safe and compliant. Consider the long-term maintenance of the sign. The disconnect should be readily accessible for maintenance and repairs. You should also consider the potential for future expansion. If you plan to add additional lighting or electrical components to the sign in the future, you should select a disconnect with a capacity that can accommodate the increased load. Properly documenting the installation is also important. Keep records of all electrical work, including load calculations, disconnect ratings, and wiring diagrams. This documentation can be helpful for future maintenance and repairs. It can also be required for inspections. In addition to the disconnecting means, consider the overcurrent protection for each circuit. Each circuit should be protected by a circuit breaker or fuse that is sized appropriately for the conductor and the load. The overcurrent protection device should be located in a readily accessible location. Ensure that the wiring is properly sized for the load and that it is installed in accordance with the NEC and local codes. Undersized wiring can overheat and cause a fire. The wiring should be protected from physical damage and environmental factors. Use appropriate conduit or other protective measures to protect the wiring from the elements. Consider surge protection. Outdoor signs are often exposed to lightning strikes and other electrical surges. Surge protection devices can help to protect the sign's electrical components from damage caused by surges. Finally, remember that safety is paramount. Always to energize the circuit before working on any electrical equipment. Use appropriate personal protective equipment, such as gloves and safety glasses. If you are not comfortable working with electricity, hire a qualified electrician to do the work. The sign structure itself should be properly designed and constructed to withstand wind loads and other environmental factors. Consult with the structural engineer to ensure that the sign is structurally sound. The sign should be properly anchored to the building or ground to prevent it from falling over. The sign's location should be carefully considered to ensure that it does not obstruct visibility or create a safety hazard. Check with local zoning regulations to ensure that the sign complies with all applicable requirements. Consider the aesthetic impact of the sign. The sign should be designed to be visually appealing and to complement the surrounding environment. The sign's lighting should be designed to be energy efficient and to minimize light pollution. Use energy-efficient lamps or LED lighting to reduce energy consumption and operating costs. Consider the environmental impact of the sign. Use sustainable materials and practices to minimize the sign's environmental footprint. Recycle or reuse materials whenever possible. Dispose of waste materials properly. By following these guidelines, you can ensure that your outdoor sign is safe, compliant, and aesthetically pleasing. Consulting with qualified professionals such as electricians and structural engineers is essential to ensure that the sign is properly designed, installed, and maintained. Remember that safety should always be the top priority. Take the time to plan and execute the project properly to avoid potential hazards and ensure long-term reliability.